"My mom," said Morris to his teacher during writing time, "wants you to come to our house and see her." "Okay, dear," replied Miss Bailey kindly. "I can come this afternoon." "My mom," Morris continued, "wants me to apologize because she couldn't send you a letter. Her eyes are not feeling well." "I'm sorry to hear that," said teacher, feeling a bit bad for accepting Mrs. Małgosiewski's invitation so quickly. She knew eye problems were common among the kids and their families. But Mrs. Małgosiewski didn't often ask for help unless she really needed it. She was different from most parents, Miss Bailey knew. Firstly, Mrs. Małgosiewski only had one child, Morris. She was also very tidy, proud, and didn't rely on others for help. She didn't gossip with neighbors or entertain guests randomly. Her invitations were serious, and she spoke slowly in English. Miss Bailey often wondered how Mrs. Małgosiewski would manage if she couldn't see. At 3 o'clock, Miss Bailey went with Morris to visit Mrs. Małgosiewski, leaving the class to tidy up with Miss Blake's occasional supervision. As they walked, Miss Bailey worried about Mrs. Małgosiewski's eye problem but felt a bit relieved when she learned it was a slow-forming cataract. "But of course," Miss Bailey said, "I'll help however I can, Mrs. Małgosiewski." "But maybe a neighbor." "Neighbors?" Mrs. Małgosiewski scoffed. "What would they do for my son? They have too many kids of their own. They wouldn't have time for Morris. They might come over, break things, snoop around, and sit on my furniture. They don't know how to take care of a house. They're not proper ladies like us." "You're a lady. You're kind despite your bad leg, but that's not important. I want you to look after Morris." "But I can't come here to take care of him," Miss Bailey said. "You understand that, right, Mrs. Małgosiewski? I'm really sorry about your eyes, and I hope the operation goes well. But I won't have time to come here every day." "That's not what my mom meant," Morris clarified. He was leaning against teacher and petting her muff. "My mom meant about the money." "That's what I meant," Mrs. Małgosiewski agreed, nodding her head so much that her wig almost fell off. "Morris needs money. He can use it to fix things at home instead of having nosy neighbors. He can buy what he needs from the store. But he needs 10 cents a day. His dad works far away in Harlem. He earns good money but can't come here to take care of Morris. And the doctor says I have to go to the hospital. And anyway," she added sadly, "I'm not useful, I can't see. The doctor says I'll stay in the hospital for 3 weeks, which is 21 days. For Morris, it's $2.10. I have the money." And she searched for her purse in her pockets. "So, you want me to hold the money and give Morris 10 cents every day, is that it?" asked Miss Bailey. "Yes," replied Mrs. Małgosiewski. "It's a lot of money," said Morris sadly. 10 cents a day is a lot for one boy." "No, my dear," said his mother. "It's right that you have enough money. And your teacher, a kind lady, though honest, how many neighbors are honest, will give you 10 cents every morning. I'll pay the rent before I leave, and with the rent paid and 10 cents a day, you'll live like a rich person." "Yes, yes," Morris agreed, repeating a familiar promise. "Every day, I'll pray and wash my face, keep the neighbors away, and visit you on Thursdays and Sundays at the hospital. And on Saturdays," added Miss Bailey, "you'll come to my house and spend the day with me. You're too young to go to the synagogue alone." "That sounds nice," said Morris. "I'd like to come to your house. I really like your dog." "What?" exclaimed his mother. "Dogs. Dogs are just trouble. They eat a lot and don't do anything. That's what my mom thinks, Morris explained quickly, not wanting to upset his mother. But she hasn't seen your dog. He's really nice, I like him a lot. I don't need to see him, said Mrs. Małgorzata a bit sharply. I've seen plenty of dogs already. Don't you go getting into trouble with him. Don't go and get bitten by him. Of course not, Miss Bailey reassured her quickly. He'll only play with Rover if I'm busy or can't take him out with me. He'll be safer at my house than on the streets, and you wouldn't want him to stay indoors all day. After some more talking and warnings, the plan was agreed upon. Miss Bailey was given $2.10 and the responsibility of looking after Morris. A day later, Mrs. Małgorzata went to the hospital and the neighbors were kept out of her apartment. Morris politely refused all their offers of help and visits. Every morning, Miss Bailey gave Morris his daily allowance, sometimes adding some fruit or other food that met his dietary rules because Morris strictly followed religious food laws. The Saturday after his mother left, Morris spent time with Rover, an old collie who didn't wander far from home anymore. Miss Bailey's family also tried to entertain Morris, but he liked Rover the most, along with the cook who let him help prepare his lunch according to his customs. Everything seemed to go well, so Miss Bailey expected Morris to visit again the following Saturday. However, she was surprised when Morris said he wanted to stay home the next day. Oh no, she objected. You shouldn't stay home. I'm taking you to the park and we'll have lots of fun. Wouldn't you rather see the lions and elephants with me than stay home alone? Morris stayed quiet for a moment, then finally managed to say, I'm not alone. Has your dad come home? Asked Miss Bailey. No, ma'am. And it can't be a neighbor. Remember what your mom said about them, how you shouldn't let them in. It's not neighbors, Morris explained. Then who? Miss Bailey started. Morris looked up at her with his big, pleading eyes, hoping for her understanding and sympathy. It's a friend, he replied. Is it Nathan Spiderwitz? She asked. Morris shook his head, indicating that Nathan Spiderwitz was also considered a neighbor. Well, who is it, sweetheart? She asked again. Is it someone I know? No, ma'am. None of the boys from school? No, ma'am. How long have you known him? Not long, ma'am. Does your mom know him? Oh, teacher, no, ma'am. My mom doesn't know him. Where did you meet him? Teacher, on the sidewalk. Yesterday night, Morris explained, knowing he had to tell her. I was lying in bed, thinking about my mom being sick and my dad being away and having nobody with me. It made me feel really sad. So I couldn't stay in bed. I put on some more clothes and went out to the street where people were. I sat on the sidewalk, feeling my heart ache inside. I thought about my mom and seeing her with bandages on her face, and it made me feel even worse. And, teacher, Miss Bailey, I cried about it. Of course you did, honey, said teacher, putting her arm around him. Poor little lonely guy. Of course you cried. Teacher, yes, ma'am, boys aren't supposed to cry, but I cried about it. And then something touched me on my side, and I turned and my friend was sitting beside me. And he didn't say anything, teacher. No, ma'am, he didn't say anything, he just looked at me, and there were tears in his eyes. That made me feel better in my heart, and I stopped crying. I sat and looked at my friend, and he sat and looked at me with a smiling face. So I went home and my friend came with me and I lay in my bed and my friend lay beside me. And every time that night when I opened my eyes and thought about my mom being sick and my dad being away, my friend was there beside me and I didn't cry. I never cry when my friend is with me. And I couldn't come to your house tomorrow because I don't know if my friend would like Rover. Of course he'd like him, cried Miss Bailey. Rover would play with him just like he plays with you. No, ma'am, Morris disagreed. My friend is too little to play with Rover. Is he really that small? Yes, ma'am, very small. And has he been with you since the day before yesterday? Teacher, yes, ma'am. Does he seem happy and okay? Teacher, yes, ma'am. But, Miss Bailey asked, getting practical suddenly, what does the poor little guy eat? 10 cents can buy a lot of food for one boy, but not so much for two. Teacher, no, ma'am, Morris said, it's not so much. Well, then, said Miss Bailey, what if I give you 20 cents a day as long as your little friend is with you? That would be really nice, Morris agreed. And, Miss Bailey, he continued, if you don't need all of your lunch, maybe my friend could eat it. Oh, I'm so sorry, she exclaimed. It's ham today. That's okay for my friend, said Morris, he likes ham. Now, Morris, said Miss Bailey very seriously, as she understood the seriousness of this news, this is a big deal. You know how your mom feels about people she doesn't know, and you know how she feels about Christians. What will she say to you, and to me, when she finds out that a strange little Christian is staying with you? I know it's nice for you to have someone to keep you company, especially when you're lonely in the evenings, but I'm worried that your mom won't be happy about it. Wouldn't you rather come to my house and stay there until your mom is better? You know, she added, trying to persuade him, Rover is there. But Morris didn't seem excited. I guess, he said, I don't love Rover that much. He's too big. I like little dogs with brown eyes, who walk on their legs and carry things in their mouths. Have you ever seen dogs like that? In the circus, teacher replied. Where did you see them? A boy in our neighborhood has one, Morris answered. He loves that dog a lot, and the dog loves him. Well, maybe you could teach Rover to walk on his hind legs and carry things, suggested teacher. And as for your new little Christian friend? I don't know if he's a Christian, Morris admitted reluctantly. He hasn't said anything about it to me. But a lady who lives near our house said my friend is Irish. Okay, then he's a Christian, Miss Bailey reassured him, and I won't stop you from staying home and playing with him tomorrow. But we can't let this continue. Your mom might not want your friend in the house when she comes back from the hospital. Have you thought about that, Morris? You need to make sure your friend understands. I'll tell him, Morris promised, though I don't know if he'll understand. He's pretty little, but I'll keep telling him. Then tell him again, honey, Miss Bailey advised, and make sure he knows he has to go back to his own family once your mom is well. Where are his family? I don't understand how someone so little could be wandering around with no one to take care of him. Teacher, I'm taking care of him, Morris pointed out. All night and all the next day, Miss Bailey couldn't stop thinking about the two little ones living together in Mrs. Małgorzewski's neat apartment. Even though she was losing her sight, Mrs. Małgorzewski always kept her home clean and tidy. When teacher thought about the mom lying in her hospital bed trusting Miss Bailey to take care of her son and her home, she felt like she had to go down to Monroe Street and check on them. At first, there was no sound when Miss Bailey reached Mrs. Małgorzewski's door after climbing all those stairs. But as her heart stopped pounding and the ringing in her ears quieted down a bit, she could hear Morris's familiar voice. "Bread," he said, "is really good for you, but you shouldn't eat it without chewing. I've never seen how you eat." Though the words were a bit bossy, they were filled with love and care in the voice. There was even a hint of happiness, a feeling of joy that Teacher hadn't seen in Morris before. She leaned against the door frame, listening as Morris continued. "I don't think you know what's polite. You should come to school, and Miss Bailey can teach you what's polite and good for you. No, you can't have any meat." "No, sir." "No, ma'am. You can't have any meat until I cut it for you. You might make yourself sick and embarrassed." Miss Bailey gently pushed the door open and saw Morris and his little friend. They were sitting face to face at the table, everything tidy and set up correctly. A lamp was lit, shining brightly. Morris's hair was combed neatly, and it seemed like his friend had also been groomed for the meal. Each of them had a napkin tied around their necks. Morris was carefully serving his friend's dinner, while the guest, an Irish terrier with one floppy ear, happily accepted Morris's instructions and looked at him with trust and love. The guest was the first to notice Miss Bailey. He grabbed a piece of bread, jumped down, and walked over to Teacher on his hind legs, offering her the bread. "Oh, Teacher!" "Teacher!" exclaimed Morris, partly surprised and partly happy that his trusted confidant had discovered his secret and appreciated his friend. "Oh, Teacher!" "Miss Bailey! This is the friend I told you about. See how he walks on his feet. See how he looks so happy. See how he carries things with his teeth. He does that all the time. Rover doesn't carry anything, and goldfish don't even have feet. Only Izzy can do those things." "Is his name Izzy?" asked Miss Bailey, trying to keep the conversation going and shaking the paw that the stranger offered her. "And this is the friend you were talking about?" "You let me believe," she scolded, mimicking Morris's earlier sternness, "that he was a boy." "I was scared," Morris admitted honestly. Teacher felt a mix of emotions as she watched the two friends at dinner from Mrs. Maugelisky's chair. It showed how much Morris cared for his little friend and how grateful the friend was. Morris hardly ate anything and soon sat by Teacher's side, discussing what to do. He didn't want to separate from Izzy right away, but eventually agreed to slowly prepare his mother to accept another member of the family. "And he eats," Morris had to admit, "he eats a lot, Miss Bailey, almost like a person. And my mom, I don't know what she'll say. She didn't want me to keep my last little dog because he didn't eat as much as Izzy does. And I can't really keep him," said Miss Bailey sadly, "because, you see, there is Rover. Rover might not like it. But there is one thing I can do. I'll keep him for a few days when your mother comes back, and then we'll see, you and I, if we can persuade her to let you have him always." "She wouldn't ever do it," said Morris sadly. "That other dog, didn't I tell you how he didn't eat as much as Izzy, and she wouldn't let me have him?" "That's for sure." "Oh, don't say that word, dear," cried Teacher. "And we can only try. We'll do our very, very best." This secret made Morris feel less excited about his mother coming back. On the day she was supposed to return, he felt torn between his love for her and his duty to Izzy. Early in the morning, Izzy was moved to Miss Bailey's yard. Rover was kept on his leash near his house, and Izzy was tied to the wall a safe distance away. They made a lot of noise, disturbing the whole neighborhood. Morris stayed home to welcome his mother, cooked dinner, and went to afternoon school feeling guilty and heavy-hearted. In those first hours, there was no sign that Mrs. Małgorzatski's opinion about pets had changed. She seemed even more strict and opinionated compared to the kind and understanding Miss Bailey. At 3:15, after giving some attention to the goldfish and leaving the monitors in charge, Morris and teacher went to talk to Mrs. Małgorzatski about adopting Izzy. It was hard to get her attention. Mrs. Małgorzatski was so busy chatting and feeling happy about her regained sight that it was difficult to interrupt her. Finally, Miss Bailey brought up money matters. "You gave me," she said, $2.10, and Morris has managed so well that he hasn't spent it all. He has 5 cents to give back to you. He's a very special little boy, Mrs. Małgorzatski, she said, smiling at Morris to encourage him. "He is a good boy," Mrs. Małgorzatski agreed. "Do you ever feel lonely here by yourself, huh?" "Well," said Miss Bailey, "he wasn't always alone." "No?" asked Mrs. Małgorzatski, looking for her purse to put away Morris's extra money. "No," said teacher, "I was here once or twice." "And then a little friend of his—" "Friend," Mrs. Małgorzatski repeated sharply, "was his friend here in my house?" Miss Bailey started to give a vague answer, but Mrs. Małgorzatski wasn't paying attention. She searched her dress pockets, then other places where she might have put her purse. She checked her bag and shook out her outdoor clothes. "Oh no," she cried, "I can't find it." And then everyone joined in the search. They looked everywhere in the apartment, but the pocketbook was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Małgorzatski was distraught, fearing eviction and hunger, while Morris cried along with his mother. Miss Bailey tried to figure out how much she could help replace, thinking of the rent that was due. As a last resort, she suggested checking the stairs, where a purse might have fallen unnoticed. But then, they heard a scratching sound on the door. Mrs. Małgorzatski absent-mindedly opened the door, and in came Izzy, standing tall on his hind legs, with a rope trailing behind him and the pocketbook in his mouth. Mrs. Małgorzatski was stunned. She sat down heavily, staring at Izzy. He laid the pocketbook at her feet, then offered his paw to shake. "Oh my," said Mrs. Małgorzatski, "what kind of dog is that?" She checked her money, shook Izzy's paw, then hugged him tightly. "He's not just a dog, he's a friend," she said, crying with joy. Miss Bailey, who had received excellent education in college and learned a lot about psychology, knew when it was the right time to leave. She stood up to say goodbye, and Mrs. Małgorzatski also got up, still holding Izzy. She showered Izzy with affection, and he gratefully accepted all her love. "I think," said Miss Bailey as she was leaving, "you should let that dog come with me. He seems nice, calm, and very smart. He can stay in the yard with Rover." Morris looked from Miss Bailey to his mother, and Izzy, sensing the moment, licked Mrs. Małgorzatski's cheek. "This dog," she said firmly, "is mine. Nobody else can have him. When I was in trouble, who helped me? Not people, not neighbors, not even you, Miss Teacher. It was this dog. He stays with me. Morris, my dear, you don't mind your mama having dogs, do you? You're not upset?" "No, ma'am," said Morris obediently. "Miss Bailey said it's good for boys to love cats, dogs, and horses." "Good," said his mother. "Maybe that's not such a bad idea." Later, as bedtime approached, Mrs. Małgorzatski brought up the conversation from before they found out about the lost purse. "So, my dear," she said, reclining in her chair with Izzy on her lap, "you had friends over when I was in the hospital?" "Just one," Morris replied softly. "Well, I'm not upset," said his mother. "Where is your friend? I'd like to see him."
Isn't he coming tonight?
No, ma'am, said Morris, snuggling closer to his mother. He can't go out at night because a lady adopted him.